first volume of the Acts commentary is out. Hope you will take the appropriate hint. In addition to the ethical violations, I'm also being politically inept because my publisher's reception is going on right now. So there's no one from Baker Academic here to know that I tried to help them promote my book. A minority of scholars have compared Acts to ancient novels. Although Luke Acts addresses the sort of popular readership shared with novels, rather than the more rhetorically sophisticated, more elite readership of common multi-volume history, the majority of Acts scholars see the work as ancient historiography, following the arguments laid out generations ago by Martin Debelius and Henry Cadbury. Nearly all the features in Acts that some associate with novels also appear in historical works. Indeed, some features in Acts that proponents of the novel thesis associate with novels, such as Paul's sufferings, are attested even more abundantly in Paul's own letters. Most novels were romances, a feature notoriously lacking in Acts. The smaller number of historical novels involved characters who had lived centuries earlier, and only extremely rarely, in fact, so far as I know, never, characters within living memory of the writers. Novels also lacked historical prefaces, in contrast to Luke Acts. The one sometimes cited exception, if you actually look it up, is a preface telling how the novelist made the story up. More importantly, there is simply too much history in Acts to discount. History is not characteristic of the vast majority of novels. Historians often made inferences, and various historians sometimes made mistakes, and frequently the chances of preservation have left us without any corroboration for many of their claims. But works that addressed historical subjects, and that can be corroborated externally at a number of points, were historical works, and not novels. Ancient historiography differs from its modern namesake that developed from it. For example, it could be more overt in its moral, political, or theological agendas than modern histories are. Further, readers expected ancient historians to produce a cohesive and engaging narrative, not always a paramount issue today, even in scholarly papers. We should also take into account the differences in the way historians often provided speeches, a matter much discussed among both Acts scholars and experts in ancient historiography more generally. It is important to take into account the differences between ancient and modern approaches to historical writing, lest we judge Acts according to rules of a genre that technically did not yet exist. Failure to note such differences has sometimes led more conservative scholars to defend what I would regard as weak positions. If I can shift the Gospels for a moment, just to give an example. Sometimes people assume that everything in the Gospels has to be in chronological order, and then when you compare Matthew and Luke, and the order is sometimes different, they say, we have a mistake, when ancient biographies didn't have to keep things in chronological order. It wasn't expected, it wasn't part of the genre. You could, but you didn't have to. Sometimes led more conservative scholars to defend what I would regard as weak positions, and more skeptical scholars to charge Acts with being imprecise, where ancient writers would have simply seen themselves as following the rules of the genre. Nevertheless, I will enter that caveat. The differences between ancient and modern historiography are too often exaggerated. A range of ancient writers testify that history, as opposed to some other genres, had to achieve its ends by working with factual information. Thus, for example, Aristotle notes that the difference. This is a philosophic society, so you've all heard of Aristotle, right? Okay, all right. Aristotle notes that the differences between history and poetry, the difference is not their literary style, but that the former recounts what actually happened. Cicero contrasts the objective of entertainment in mythical poetry with the objective of truth in historiography. Pliny the Younger says that in contrast to some other genres, history's primary goal was truth and accuracy, rather than just showing off rhetorical abilities. To test such claims more empirically, I compared an ancient history with two ancient biographies, all from roughly a generation after the events recorded, so roughly about the time that the Gospels and Acts are dated, within a few years either way. Although we can't expect each author to select the same information to report, I found roughly 50 points of correspondence in the shortest works, roughly 28 paragraphs. That is, ancient historians and biographers, especially those writing concerning recent figures, depended on prior information and not simply their imaginations. Moreover, the critical standards of modern historiography, far from being a modern invention, were developed by Polybius and other historians in antiquity. How late did you say that manuscript of Polybius was? Okay. Ancient historians, at their best, sought to evaluate their sources, referring eyewitnesses and earlier accounts, testing their sources for internal consistency, coherence with topography, and other information, such as modern historians would do. Modern prejudices against them are anachronistic and often ethnocentric. Let's look at the preface to Luke Acts. Both were written by the same author, whom I believe to be Luke. Luke Acts also includes what appeared very much like the prefaces found in histories. Loveday Alexander, who argued instead for parallels in scientific treatises, has clarified since then that she does not mean that Luke was writing a scientific treatise. Rather, he was writing a kind of historiography more careful than that of more rhetorically oriented historians. Most scholars see Luke's first work, the preface in his Gospel, as a specifically historical preface, since it summarizes the content of the work as an orderly narrative of the things fulfilled among us, which is appropriate for talking about history. Likewise, Luke's explicit purpose is to confirm what Theophilus has learned about such events, Luke 1:4. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Lucian, and other writers employ similar language for works involving history. At least for his Gospel, Luke claims the availability of many written documents covering the same ground he covers, Luke 1:1, although this is probably especially for his Gospel rather than for Acts. Further, although he sought to write a more orderly account in some sense, he did not see his work departing substantially from the facts of his predecessors. In Luke 1:4, he saw his purpose as confirmatory. Their proximity and basic substance may reflect the relatively recent nature of the events that they report, addressed below. Ancient historians from the Eastern Mediterranean world preferred primary research. Luke's claim of thorough knowledge or investigation in Luke 1:3 can fit this expectation. How far did he carry this interest? Luke's appeal to autoptai, eyewitnesses, fits the appreciation for research in Hellenistic historiography and has parallels in some histories. The specific term autopsia, historians sometimes use today, is a rare one, but the convention of appeal to such sources is widespread. The ideal for ancient historians was to have seen events themselves. Since this was not always possible, they often had to depend on oral sources, people they would interview, and so on. Another point, criterion of embarrassment. Some features of Luke's story would not likely be invented by Luke because they did not make his chief protagonist look good. For example, Paul's conflict with Barnabas. Given the relatively low status of artisans, Luke is unlikely to have invented such activity for Paul, Priscilla, and Aquila, in a document dedicated to a person of status, namely Theophilus. Likewise, the warnings by the Spirit that Paul should not go to Jerusalem in 21:4 meet the criterion of embarrassment, since Paul insisted God wanted him to go to Jerusalem anyway. Such narratives probably reflected the ambiguities of genuine charismatic experience. I say that as a full fact. The most prominent of embarrassments, however, is Paul's association with various riots, about 9 or 10 of them reported in Acts. The majority of commentators date Luke Acts to the period somewhere between 70 and 90. The second largest group dated to the 60s, and smaller minorities dated later. Although my best guess falls within the majority range, I believe that Acts fits best relatively soon after the events. Luke reports riots against Paul in numerous locations, riots that would feed into the very charges against Paul that keep him in custody for the final quarter of Acts. For instance, the charge in 24:5, he stirs up dissension everywhere. Luke would hardly invent evidence to support charges against Paul. More likely, the evidence remained widely known and Luke had to explain it. Although this observation does not offer a precise date, I believe it is most consistent with a date in the 60s or the 70s. My reasons for preferring a date at least somewhat after 70, with F.F. Bruce's later position and Ben Withington, I'm covering myself here, so those of you dated earlier know that I'm in at least good company. Rather than the date near 62, preferred by many commentators, are not really relevant to this paper. But if you do want to be contentious, just give me a break. It's only 10 or 15 years. In some cases, such as the riot in Ephesus, repercussions might be even more serious than Luke reports. Many scholars think that one reason that Paul later avoids Ephesus is that Paul experienced more decisive hostility there than most other locations. Testing Luke with external sources. Long ago, Cadbury, I believe Charlie Parker, is that right? Observed that just as one can evaluate someone's knowledge of modern Oxford and Cambridge by one's ability to name correctly the presiding officer of each college, whether it's master, principal, provost, warden, so on. So one may test Luke's knowledge of municipal institutions in Aegean cities. His language fully meets the test. For over 200 pages in a 1989 work published by Moore Seebeck, Colin Hemer provides a massive list of accurate correspondences between Acts and external sources. To simply ignore or dismiss his evidence because one does not like his conclusions, as some more skeptical scholars have done, is to violate the best traditions in liberal critical scholarship. One could consume the entire paper giving examples from his list, but that would prove tedious. It would also make me run over my time. So here are several examples. The family of Sergius Paulus is attested. In Acts 17:1, the mention of Amphipolis and Apollonia allows for the journey from Philippi to Thessalonica to be divided into realistic travel legs. The itinerary, weather conditions, and sailors' actions are correct down to minute details in most of Acts 27 and 28. One could multiply examples of correspondences. Correct details for the interior of Asia Minor, such as the correct local pairing of Zeus and Hermes, the choice of Roman colonies and sequence in the Via Sebast, and so forth, are not information that was widely known, and no novelist would have traveled to these areas to do research there. Luke's characterization of, and I'm going beyond Colin Hemer now because you can read that separately if you want. But Luke's characterization of Herod Agrippa in Acts 12 fits what we know of this king and Josephus. Zealous to please his people, eager to assert his Jewish identity, yet ultimately killed for accepting divine honors. Luke's report of Agrippa's death is clearly independent of the report in Josephus, but incidental overlaps corroborates the event and various reported elements of it, such as the location in Caesarea, Agrippa's special apparel, flatterers acclaiming him as divine, Agrippa being struck down just afterward, and his death soon after that. The known timing of both Gallio's governorship in Acts 18 and particularly explicit anti-Jewish sentiments fits Luke's description in Acts 18 well. Regarding Acts chapter 19, historian Fergus Miller observes, concerning Luke's report of this incident, no text illustrates better the city life of the Greek East. Here are just a few of the external correspondences with Luke's account of the riot about the Ephesian Artemis in Acts 19. On other occasions, Ephesus as a city publicly defended the Artemis cult. The city had never taken lightly insults to the Artemis cult. Asia Minor cities had many riots and much unrest in this period. Grammatus, or the clerk, was the correct title for Ephesus' leading official. Economic concerns for Artemis' temple were of special interest in this period. Luke's concern of titles that he gives to goddess Artemis were not widely used for Artemis outside of Ephesus, but they're attested in the inscriptions in Ephesus. The shops of the silversmiths may have been located on the road from the harbor to the theater, and were probably relatively close to the theater where the riot was stirred up by Demetrius the silversmith. The careful itinerary in Acts 20 and 21 and their contexts belonging to the Lee material, which I'll talk about later if I get time to do so, serves no overt theological purpose. Yet, as one early 20th century scholar remarked, the narrative portion of this is full and correct enough for a guidebook. During the Jerusalem temple riot in Acts 21, that the report came up to the tribune in charge of the garrison, that the soldiers ran down, and the later mention of the stairs, all these details fit the topography of the temple that we know now from archaeology. Some scholars doubt Luke's claim of Paul's Roman citizenship, contending that as a Jew, Paul's father could not have belonged to the municipal elite and thus achieved Roman citizenship. Philo of Alexandria, however, speaks of an entire community of Jewish Roman citizens living across the Tiber in Rome. Jews had purchased the freedom of Judeans enslaved by Pompey. As freed slaves of Roman citizens, these Jews became Roman citizens, as did their descendants. As for whether any of these descendants of Roman freedmen might immigrate to Jerusalem, as Paul or his family may have done, the famous Theodotus inscription for Jerusalem names Theodotus' father Vatinos, a name that probably suggests that he was a freed slave or descended from a freed slave. So in other words, the scholars have said, Paul can't be a Roman citizen, you didn't have Jewish Roman citizens. It's against all the evidence. The objection that Paul's letters never use the trionomina, the full three names associated with Roman citizens, is misplaced. These names were often not used in the Eastern Empire. Moreover, Paul is not writing inscriptions. Letter writers, even in Rome, often used only one or two of the names. Of at least 50 Jewish funerary inscriptions of Jewish Roman citizens in Ephesus, none bears the three names. In fact, the name Paul was nearly always the name of a Roman citizen, especially in the Eastern Empire. So many ancient hearers would guess his citizenship simply from his letters. Moreover, apart from his Roman citizenship, his appeal and consequently the final quarter of Acts becomes inexplicable, despite being the most detailed part of Acts and also part of the we material. When in Acts 22, Paul announces that he's a Roman citizen, the tribune responds, I paid much money for my citizenship. It was especially during the reign of Claudius that Roman citizenship was widely bought and sold. It was sold expensively during the beginning of Claudius's reign, but prices fell gradually during the rest of his reign. The tribune probably hopes that Paul's citizenship was acquired more cheaply than his. Hence, Paul is of lower status. Someone creating a story long after Claudius's reign would not think to invent such a retort. In fact, Paul says he was born a citizen, so the tribune is forced to make amends quickly for having chained him. If not arraigned in Rome, governors sometimes got away with mistreating citizens, but a tribune such as Claudius Lysias could not hope to get off so lightly. Luke would hardly have gone to such the trouble of securing precise names for the governors of Judea in the right sequence for his period if he were writing a novel. The roles and the characterization of Felix and Festus, on the other hand, fit well a work of history and what we know of them. Felix, for example, was married 3 times, but the wife mentioned in the text, Drusilla, is the correct wife for the time of Paul's appearance. But Philip II's sister Berenice lived with him only during certain times, such as immediately after her divorce. When Paul appeared before the 2 Acts was in fact the correct time. Even Felix's question of Paul's province and his immediately subsequent decision to decide the case himself fit Paul's lifetime better than the period after 70, and especially substantially after that. Cilicia Pedius was in precisely this period part of the larger Roman province of Syria Cilicia. Cilicia became a separate province again only in 72 CE. By most scholars' dates for Acts, it was thus separate again when Luke was writing. 10 minutes? Okay, I'm going to speak a little bit more quickly, is that right? Like many other points in Acts, this detail reflects a situation much more relevant to Paul's day than to Luke's. Luke, having nothing to gain, even in his credibility, presenting it this way, since much of his audience would not have known this detail. A.N. Sherwin White, the one Roman historian who has written on the matter at length and with particular expertise, has adequately demonstrated the legal accuracy of many features of Luke's accounts of Paul's trials. Moreover, Paul's defense speeches fit what one expects for records of official proceedings, which would have been available to the defendant and were normally summaries of roughly the length that Luke provides. Paul's letters offer further confirmations. No one denies differences between Acts and Paul's letters, still less points of silence in one or the other, but the correspondences are too many for coincidence of Luke's invention. More than a century ago, the liberal scholar Adolf von Harnack offered a list of 39 cases where Paul's letters corroborate Acts. A few examples from the list should suffice. Barnabas being an apostle in addition to the 12, Peter and John standing out among the 12, Peter being the chief leader, James, the Lord's brother, became no less authoritative than Peter and John. Mark is closely connected with Barnabas. Silas was a fellow minister with Paul, with Timothy more subordinate. Signs and wonders accompany apostleship. Paul persecuted Christians, and so on. Likewise, where they overlap, Luke's record of Paul's life and mission very closely matches even the sequence that we can reconstruct from Paul's letters, as many scholars have noted. Paul persecuted believers, Paul was converted, he went to Damascus, he went then to Jerusalem, then to Syria and Cilicia, then to Jerusalem again after 14 years, to Antioch, to Philippi, to Thessalonica, to Athens, to Corinth, to Ephesus, to Macedonia, to Corinth again, to Jerusalem, and to Rome. Same sequence that we reconstruct both from Paul's letters and from the book of Acts. That's not likely a coincidence. In both Acts and the Thessalonian correspondence, Silas and Timothy accompanied Paul to Thessalonica. Paul reached Thessalonica after public humiliation in Philippi. He and the believers in Thessalonica faced public suffering, and unemployment was a significant local problem. The smaller differences suggest that Luke writes independently of 1 Thessalonians, but there are nevertheless very many correspondences. 1 Corinthians provides extensive information about the church in Corinth, which often overlaps with information in Acts. For example, the founders of the Corinthian church were Paul, Silas, and Timothy, but Paul began the Corinthian mission before the others arrived. He earned his living in Corinth, and again, I have the references for each of these, but I'm trying to speed ahead. A prominent early convert was named Crispus. Aquila and Priscilla used their home for God's work and had connections with Rome, Ephesus, and Corinth. Apollos' ministry in Corinth followed Paul's, and he was also associated with Ephesus. Paul faced conflicts in Ephesus. In both Acts and Paul's letters, Paul planned to visit in the precise sequence: Macedonia, Achaia, Judea, and then Rome. While in Ephesus, Paul sent Timothy to the west. He later appears in Corinth with Paul. Paul visited Corinth with traveling companions from various cities. Their names overlap in both sources. Many commentators, however, contrast Paul's claim of a probably Corinthian household as the first fruits of Achaia with Luke's report of earlier converts in Athens. So they say, Luke can't be right about converts in Athens because Paul says the first fruits of the province of Achaia were in Corinth. Unfortunately for their contrast, Athens was a free city in this period and did not belong to the Roman province of Achaia. Anyway, Paul escaping Damascus by being let down from a wall in a basket appears in both Acts and 2 Corinthians. Both Luke and Paul report Paul's stoning. Luke knows not only many of the major figures attested in Paul's letters, including Peter, John, James, Barnabas, Silas, Timothy, Aquila, and Priscilla, but also some of the less prominent, such as Mark, Aristarchus, Tychicus, Sopater, Crispus, Trophimus, probably Jason and Sosthenes. I'm aware that scholars divide over which event in Acts fits Galatians 2, and I don't have time to elaborate here, but I concur with J.D. Lightfoot, Bob Stein, Simon Kistemacher, and I'm listing some of these because I know some of you won't agree with me. I just want to say again that I'm on the right side. All right, anyway. But I believe Luke and Paul emphasize very different aspects of the Jerusalem Council, but I believe that the overlap is significant. I'm one of the ones who takes Galatians 2 along with Acts 15. They have the same basic object, the same basic outcome. Paul's mission is recognized. Leaders agreed that Gentiles need not be circumcised. Peter was involved. James was involved. James holds special rank in the assembly. James is apparently associated with the more conservative faction in both of these reports. In one letter written from Corinth, Paul expected trouble in Judea, Romans 15, and in his next extant letters reveal him in Roman custody. Pauline letters mention his captivity and chains, which in an ancient setting also fit the criterion of embarrassment. It's not something that somebody would make up. No novel known to us from antiquity betrays such detailed correspondences with external, incidental information. Moreover, no ancient author would have worked so hard to extract such information from occasional documents that failed to cite them. Such sorts of correspondences are the sorts one expects in historical works dependent on information, not novels freely composed. It is not without reason that Edward Meyer, perhaps the 20th century's most renowned historian of Greco-Roman antiquity, opined that Luke was a great historian. The we narratives. On several occasions, the narrator indicates his presence with the group by using the first person plural. Those who doubt that an eyewitness stands behind the we narratives often argue that it's fictitious. Yet the we narratives do not represent the most important or exotic scenes where a fictitious witness would be expected to exert oneself. We does not appear at Pentecost or Jesus' resurrection encounters. Instead, we narratives show up in related locations, as one would expect from a genuine witness. One traveling from Troas to Philippi picks up years later, several years later in Philippi again, and then goes to Jerusalem, and later from Judea to Rome. Apart from intimating his presence, the narrator shows no interest in recounting his own activity. It is further no coincidence that the we narratives provide the most detailed accounts in Acts. The missionary's brief time in Philippi receives more detailed attention than 18 months in Corinth, and as much as 2 years in the Roman province of Asia. But scholars often attribute the many accurate details of travel in Acts 21 to a diary, and that Paul's 2 years in Judea are the most detailed portion of the book, also contribute to this likelihood. Am I reading too fast for you guys to? Okay, so I'm going to keep reading fast. Accusations that Luke's reports of Paul's thinking diverge too far from Paul's letters to reflect a genuine traveling companion of Paul are misplaced. Sometimes the contrasts even reflect the now discredited older views about Paul opposing the Torah. Of course, the emphases and perspectives often differ from those in Paul's letters, but then no one is arguing that Paul wrote the we narratives. A traveling companion would not hold exactly the same perspectives and certainly not need the same argumentation as Paul.